There's a debate happening right now about what it means to be a woman. Who counts? Who doesn't? Where the line is? Who gets to draw it? And most people treating it as a new question. It isn't. This exact debate about the definition of womanhood, about who qualifies, about what the standard is, has appeared in many major rights disputes in American history for 200 years. Same structure, different targets, different century. Again and again, the definition of womanhood was used not to describe women, but to exclude some of them. That's what this video is about. I want to be precise about the argument I'm making. I'm not arguing that definitions don't matter. They do. I'm not arguing that biology is irrelevant. It isn't. What I am arguing is this. When the definition of womanhood is invoked urgently in a political context to resolve a question about rights and access, the definition is not doing descriptive work. It's doing gatekeeping work. And we know this, not from theory, not from ideology, but from history. 4 case studies, 200 years, one pattern. Let's go through them. 1848, Seneca Falls, New York, the first women's rights convention in American history. The Declaration of Sentiments is signed. Women demand the right to vote. The suffrage movement is born. And immediately, the debate becomes, what kind of woman deserves the vote? There was a dominant cultural ideal at the time called the cult of true womanhood. 4 pillars: piety, purity, submissiveness, domesticity. A true woman was religious, chaste, obedient to her husband, and confined to the home. That was the definition. That was the standard. And here's where it gets complicated. Some of the most prominent suffragists, Elizabeth Cady Stanton for one, used this framework strategically. The argument wasn't all women deserve the vote. The argument was educated, refined, civilized women deserve the vote. More than, in some of their framing, black men who had just been granted the right by the 15th Amendment. Stanton wrote explicitly that it was an insult for educated white women to be denied a right given to what she called the lower orders. The argument for women's suffrage was being built by some of its leaders on a definition of womanhood that was used in ways that excluded black women. And then, 1920, the 19th Amendment passes. Women get to vote. Except poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses, voter intimidation. Black women who had organized, who had marched, who had fought for suffrage alongside and often ahead of their white counterparts, were systematically blocked from the polls across the South. The amendment said women, but the machinery of enforcement said something different. The definition of woman who can vote remained racialized in practice for another 45 years, until the Voting Rights Act of 1965. One rights movement, one definition of womanhood, used to exclude along racial and class lines by the people claiming to fight for women. That's case study 1. Let's go further back. For most of American legal history and English legal history before it, a married woman did not legally exist. That's not a metaphor. That's the law. The doctrine was called coverture, and it was explained most clearly by the English legal commentator William Blackstone in 1765. He wrote, "By marriage, the husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, or at least is incorporated and consolidated into that of the husband. One person, the husband. Under coverture, a married woman could not own property, could not sign contracts, could not sue or be sued in her own name, could not keep her own wages, could not refuse her husband legally. Her legal identity, her personhood, was absorbed into his." Now, what definition of womanhood made this possible? The definition of a proper woman. A woman in her natural, correct, ordained role as wife, as dependent, as extension of her husband's household. Coverture wasn't framed as a restriction, it was framed as a description. This is what women are. This is what the institution of marriage means. Women who resisted, who tried to work to own property, to maintain legal independence, weren't just breaking the law. They were failing to be proper women. The definition of womanhood did the work of justifying the legal structure, and the legal structure enforced the definition. Some legal effects of coverture persisted in the United States into the 1970s. Married women couldn't get credit cards in their own names until 1974. 1974. Not 200 years ago, 50. That's case study 2. 1875, the United States passes its first major federal immigration restriction. It's called the Page Act. On its face, the law prohibited the immigration of women coming for lewd and immoral purposes, prostitution essentially. The framing was about protecting the country from moral corruption. In practice, it was almost exclusively used against Chinese women. Every Chinese woman seeking entry was presumed to be coming for immoral purposes, unless she could prove otherwise. The burden of proof was reversed. Innocence was not assumed. Immorality was. The process was deliberately difficult. Women were subjected to invasive interviews by American officials in China before they could even board the ship. Questions about their character, their relationships, their intentions. The result was a dramatic reduction in the number of Chinese women admitted. The number of Chinese women admitted to the United States dropped dramatically after 1875. Chinese communities in America, already established, were prevented from forming families. Now ask, what definition of womanhood is doing this work? The definition of morally respectable womanhood, proper femininity, purity. And that definition, when applied through the machinery of immigration law, became a racial filter. White European women were not subjected to the same presumption. Their femininity, their moral respectability was assumed. Chinese women's femininity was denied. They were treated as inherently suspect, inherently improper. The Page Act used the language of women's protection, of moral standards, of proper womanhood. And it used that language to build a racial border. That's case study 3. Last case study, and this one comes from a different direction. The others used legal definitions, statute, precedent, policy. This one uses medicine. For most of the 19th century and into the 20th, there was a medical diagnosis called hysteria. It was applied almost exclusively to women, and its symptoms, by the standards of the time, included things like intellectual ambition, political engagement, refusing to defer to male authority, challenging domestic roles. A woman who wanted to work, not just because she had to, but because she wanted to, was displaying symptoms. A woman who was publicly political was displaying symptoms. A woman who rejected the terms of her marriage was displaying symptoms. The definition of healthy womanhood was built around compliance with the domestic role. Deviation from that role was medicalized. It wasn't framed as politics. It was framed as science, as medicine, as objective description of what healthy women are and what unhealthy women do. And that framing gave it enormous power. Because if your resistance to your own subordination is a symptom, then your resistance has no political standing. You're not making an argument. You're just having an episode. The pattern extended into psychiatry well into the 20th century. Homosexuality was listed as a mental disorder in the DSM, the American Diagnostic Manual, until 1973. Women who didn't conform to gender expectations were routinely pathologized, institutionalized, treated with electroconvulsive therapy, medicated. The medical definition of normal womanhood did the same work as the legal definition. Same exclusion, different vocabulary. Science, medicine, objectivity. But the definition still moved to exclude the same people. That's case study 4. 4 case studies. Let me put them next to each other. 1848, a rights question emerges. Who gets to vote? The definition of womanhood is invoked. True womanhood. Pious, pure, domestic. When examined, the definition excludes black women and working class women. It was designed to. Coverture. The law defines a proper woman as a wife absorbed into her husband's legal identity. Women who resisted are not just lawbreakers, they're improper women. The definition justifies the structure enforces the definition. 1875. Immigration law defines proper womanhood through moral respectability. The definition is applied in a racially targeted way. Chinese women are presumed immoral. Their exclusion is framed as a moral standard, not a racial one. Medicine. Healthy womanhood is defined around compliance with domestic roles. Women who resist are diagnosed. Their political resistance is reclassified as pathology. The definition removes them from the conversation entirely. Notice the structure. Step 1. A question about rights and access is being contested. Step 2. The definition of womanhood is invoked urgently as though the answer is self-evident. Step 3. The definition, when examined, excludes exactly the people the invoker wanted to exclude, and the exclusion looks like common sense, because it's framed as a description, not a decision. 200 years, 4 contexts: legal, political, medical, social. Same move. In a pattern that consistent across that much time and that much context is not a coincidence. It's evidence. I want to end with something simple. The definition of womanhood has never been neutral. Every time it has been invoked with urgency in law, in medicine and politics. It has been a decision dressed up as a description. Someone decided who counts. Someone decided where the line is. And the line was always drawn to exclude someone specific. That doesn't mean definitions don't matter. They do. It means that when you hear a definition of womanhood being offered with urgency in a political context to resolve a question about who gets access to something, the right question is not what is the definition. The right question is who drew the line and who ends up on the wrong side of it. Because that part about who ends up excluded, that's the part that never changes.